What if your trust is just an illusion? I always thought our marriage was strong, that my wife Sarah was happy. We had been together for many years, and although life had become predictable, I never doubted our closeness. But one small change in her behavior made me think. And then I realized that not all secrets should remain unsolved. I never thought I would be the kind of man to doubt my wife. Trust had always been the foundation of our marriage, something I never questioned, something I believed was unshakable. We had built a life together, 8 years of shared moments, laughter, routines, and an understanding that didn't require words. But something had changed. It started subtly, so small at first that I ignored it. Sarah was always on her phone more than usual, her laughter coming in soft, almost secretive bursts at messages she never shared. When I'd ask what was so funny, she'd brush it off, saying it was just a silly meme or something a friend had sent. I wanted to believe her. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was imagining things. Then there were the late nights. At first, it was small excuses. She had errands to run, a last-minute get-together with a friend, an extra session at the gym. Each time, I told myself it was normal. We weren't newlyweds anymore. We had our own lives, our own spaces. But then, there were the changes in her behavior. She started dressing differently, choosing outfits that were more daring than what she usually wore. Perfume lingered on her skin long after she came home, scents I didn't recognize. And then there was the way she looked at me. Or rather, how she didn't. Sarah had always been affectionate, the kind of woman who touched my arm absent-mindedly as she passed, who leaned into me when we sat together, who kissed me good night even when she was exhausted. But now, her touches were scarce, her kisses quick and empty, her body stiff when she lay next to me in bed. I told myself it was just a phase. People changed, routines evolved. Maybe she was stressed. Maybe she was going through something she wasn't ready to talk about. Maybe. Doubt crept in slowly, like a shadow stretching across our home. I found myself watching her more closely, picking up on details I had never paid attention to before. The way she'd leave the room to take a call, the way she'd smile at her phone, the way she'd avoid eye contact when I asked about her day. Then, one evening, she left for another one of her meetings with a friend. I sat alone in our living room, the glow of the television casting flickering light across the empty space beside me. Something inside me told me to check, to look for the truth I wasn't sure I wanted to find. I opened her laptop, my hands shaking slightly as I navigated through the browser history. Most of it was normal, online shopping, social media, news articles. But then I saw it, a dating site, an account under a name that wasn't hers, but the profile picture was unmistakable. It was her. My heart pounded as I clicked through the messages. There were dozens of them. Conversations with a man named Nate. They weren't just casual chats. They were intimate, flirtatious, filled with things she had never said to me in years. Promises, desires, plans. I closed the laptop, my breath coming in shallow bursts. My body felt like it was sinking into the couch, as if the weight of what I had just seen was physically pressing me down. Sarah was cheating on me. The realization didn't come with an immediate outburst of anger or pain. It came in slow waves, creeping through my chest, making my hands feel numb. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at nothing, replaying every moment of the past few months in my head. All the signs were there, staring me in the face. I just refused to see them. When she came home that night, I pretended to be asleep. I listened as she moved around quietly, slipping into bed beside me like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I just didn't know what I was going to do about it yet. The days that followed my discovery were a blur. I functioned on autopilot, going through the motions of my daily routine as though nothing had changed, even though everything had. I woke up next to Sarah, ate breakfast with her, made idle conversation about work and weekend plans, all while knowing that she was betraying me. I wanted to confront her immediately. The anger burned in my chest, a constant, smoldering ache that refused to dissipate. But something held me back. Maybe it was fear of what she would say, fear of what it would mean for our marriage. Or maybe it was denial, the desperate hope that if I ignored it long enough, it would somehow disappear. But it didn't. Instead, the evidence piled up. I began to notice things I had previously overlooked. How she was suddenly more protective of her phone, how she took longer to respond to my texts, how she would smile at her screen in a way she hadn't smiled at me in months. I started watching her more closely, studying her movements like a detective piecing together a case. I took note of the times she left the house, the excuses she gave, the way she avoided intimacy with me. I even started tracking her location through the GPS on her car, something I never imagined myself doing, but desperation made me reckless. Then one evening she slipped up. She told me she was meeting Lisa, her best friend, for drinks. But when I called Lisa an hour later, casually asking if Sarah had arrived safely, Lisa hesitated before saying, "Oh, she isn't here yet. Maybe she got held up." My stomach dropped. I thanked Lisa, hung up, and sat in our darkened living room, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. If she wasn't with Lisa, where was she? The only way to find out was to go see for myself. I got in my car and drove, following the route her GPS indicated. My hands trembled against the steering wheel, my heart pounding in my ears. I told myself that I was overreacting, that there was a reasonable explanation for all of this, that I was being paranoid. But when I pulled into the parking lot of a quiet, nondescript motel on the outskirts of town, all my denial shattered. There, in the dim glow of the streetlights, was Sarah's car, parked neatly in front of one of the rooms. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the car, at the curtained window behind it, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. And then I saw him, a man I had never met before, tall, confident, stepping out of the room, running a hand through his hair before pulling his phone from his pocket. He looked around briefly before walking towards Sarah's car and leaning against it, as if waiting for something. For her. The pain that exploded in my chest was unlike anything I had ever experienced. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was grip the steering wheel and fight the overwhelming urge to storm out of my car and demand answers. But I didn't, because in that moment, I realized something crucial. This wasn't about catching her in the act. I already knew the truth. I had known it for days, weeks, maybe even months. The moment I confronted her, everything would change. Our marriage, our life, the future we had built together, it would all crumble. And I wasn't sure I was ready for that. So instead, I watched. I watched as she finally stepped out of the motel room, her hair slightly tousled, her lips curved into a soft smile as she approached him. I watched as they exchanged a few words, as he reached out to touch her waist, as she let him pull her close. And then I left. I drove home in silence, the reality of my situation settling over me like a suffocating weight. By the time Sarah returned later that night, slipping into bed beside me, as though nothing had happened, I had made my decision. I wouldn't confront her. Not yet. Because if I was going to lose my wife, my marriage, my entire world, I needed to make sure I did it on my terms. And so, the unraveling began. In the days that followed my discovery, I became an observer in my own life. I watched Sarah closely, memorizing every glance, every hesitant smile, every time she touched her phone like it held the secrets of the universe. I played my role well, pretending to be the same devoted husband, keeping my emotions locked behind a carefully constructed mask. But inside, I was unraveling. I stopped sleeping. Every night, I lay awake, listening to Sarah's steady breathing beside me, wondering if she was dreaming about him. The thought made my stomach twist. I wanted to reach for her, to demand answers, to make her admit what she had done. But I knew I wasn't ready. Not yet. Instead, I planned, if I was going to confront her, I needed proof. Irrefutable, undeniable proof that she couldn't talk her way out of. It wasn't just about knowing anymore. It was about making sure that when the moment came, she wouldn't be able to lie to my face. So, I started gathering evidence. I checked our phone records, noting the frequency of her calls and messages to a number that didn't belong to any of her friends. I took screenshots of her messages whenever I got the chance, saving them in a hidden folder on my laptop. I even installed a GPS tracker on her car, something that made me feel like a pathetic, desperate man, but I needed to know. And I did know. Each piece of evidence chipped away at any hope I had left. The messages between Sarah and Nate were filled with intimate confessions, stolen moments, and promises that made my chest tighten with rage. She told him things she hadn't told me in years. She shared parts of herself that I thought were mine alone. The breaking point came on a Friday evening. Sarah had told me she had to work late, but the tracker on her car told a different story. She wasn't at the office. She was at the same motel I'd seen her at before. This time, I didn't hesitate. I drove there with a kind of reckless determination, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My heart pounded against my ribs as I pulled into the parking lot, my eyes scanning the rows of cars until I found hers. I sat there for a long time, staring at the motel room door, knowing exactly what was happening behind it. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to storm inside, to catch them in the act, to rip apart whatever illusion they had built together. But I didn't. I waited. An hour passed before the door finally opened. Nate stepped out first. He was taller than me, younger, confident in a way that made my blood boil. A few moments later, Sarah followed, her hair slightly tousled, her expression soft and content. She looked happy, happier than she had looked with me in a long time. I clenched my jaw as she kissed him, a quick, familiar gesture that made my stomach twist. Then, she turned and walked to her car, completely unaware that I was watching. I waited until she drove away before I followed her home. My mind raced the entire drive, trying to decide how I was going to confront her, what I was going to say. By the time I pulled into our driveway, my hands were shaking with adrenaline and fury. Sarah walked through the front door like nothing had happened, greeting me with the same empty smile she had been giving me for weeks. I forced myself to stay calm, to act as if I didn't know. But the moment she kissed my cheek, I pulled away. She looked at me, confused. "Everything okay?" And that was it. The moment the dam broke. I took a deep breath, my voice steady but cold. "Who is Nate?" Her face paled instantly. The color drained from her cheeks as she took a step back, her eyes wide with something that looked an awful lot like fear. I had her cornered, and there was no way out. The moment the words left my mouth, the room seemed to shrink. The air grew thick, heavy with an unspoken tension that neither of us knew how to navigate. Sarah's face went pale, her lips parting slightly as though she wanted to speak, but couldn't find the right words. I watched her closely, taking in every flicker of emotion that crossed her face. Shock, fear, guilt. It was all there, written in the silence between us. "What are you talking about?" She finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. But I saw the way her fingers trembled as she gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, the way her breathing quickened. She was cornered, and she knew it. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to remain calm even though my pulse pounded violently in my ears. "Don't lie to me, Sarah. I know everything." Her eyes widened, and for a brief moment, I saw something else flicker in them, panic. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by something colder, more calculated. "Eric, you're being ridiculous. I don't know who you think." "Don't!" My voice came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't care. "Don't insult me by pretending. I've seen the messages. I know where you've been. I know about the motel, about Nate. So please, don't make this worse by lying." The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Her jaw clenched, and she looked away, her fingers tightening around the counter as if she were trying to steady herself. Then finally, she let out a slow breath. She hesitated, swallowing hard. "I never meant for it to happen." A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. "Never meant for it to happen? You've been sneaking around with him for weeks, months. Don't tell me it was an accident." Her eyes snapped back to mine, something like anger flashing in them now. "You don't understand." I scoffed. "Then help me understand. Explain to me how you ended up in another man's bed while I was here, trusting you." She bit her lip, exhaling shakily. "It wasn't about you. It wasn't about us. She trailed off, struggling to find the right words. "I felt invisible, Eric. Like I was just existing. Like I wasn't even a person anymore. Just someone's wife. Someone's responsibility." I stared at her, my chest tightening. "So what? You needed someone else to remind you that you're desirable? That you still matter? And that someone just happened to be Nate?" She closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to collect herself. "It wasn't planned. I didn't go looking for it. It just happened. It just happened," I repeated, shaking my head. "That's the excuse you're going with?" "I'm not making excuses," she snapped, her voice rising now. "I'm telling you how I felt. I was drowning in routine, in this monotonous life where every day was the same, where you barely even looked at me anymore. Her words hit like a slap, but I refused to let them sway me. So instead of talking to me, you turned to someone else. Instead of telling me how you felt, you decided the best way to fix things was to betray me. Her expression faltered, and she looked away. I never wanted to hurt you, but you did. My voice was quieter now, but it carried the full weight of my pain. You made a choice, Sarah, and now we have to live with it. She wiped at her eyes, her shoulders shaking slightly. I don't know what to say. I sighed, rubbing a hand over my face. I don't either. I don't even know where to begin. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, the chasm between us widening with every passing second. There was no going back from this. No simple fix, no easy way to erase what had been done. What happens now? She asked finally, her voice small, hesitant. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in our marriage, I had no answer. The silence between us stretched into days. We still lived under the same roof, moving like ghosts around each other, exchanging only the necessary words. The weight of what had happened sat heavy in the air, suffocating any remnants of warmth that once existed between us. I had thought that confrontation would bring clarity, that once the truth was out, I would know exactly what to do. But I didn't. Instead, I felt stuck, trapped between my love for Sarah and the undeniable betrayal she had inflicted on me. I couldn't simply erase the years we had spent together, the life we had built. But I also couldn't ignore the images that haunted my mind, the knowledge that when she had needed something, she had turned to another man instead of me. Sarah tried, in her own way, to make amends. She cooked meals she knew I liked, asked about my day, even reached for my hand a few times. But every time she did, I pulled away. I wasn't ready for that. I wasn't sure I ever would be. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she spoke in the darkness. Do you hate me? Her voice was small, fragile. I sighed, closing my eyes. No. Then what do you feel? I hesitated before answering. I don't know. And that was the truth. I didn't know if I could forgive her. I didn't know if I wanted to. But I also didn't know if I was ready to let go. Days turned into weeks, and the decision loomed over me like a storm cloud. I found myself thinking about what life would be like without Sarah, what it would mean to start over. Could I? Would I be able to trust anyone again? Then one afternoon I saw Nate. I hadn't been looking for him, but there he was, walking down the street, casual and unbothered, as if he hadn't played a role in destroying my marriage. I don't know what came over me, but before I knew it, I was crossing the street, my pulse hammering in my ears. Nate! He turned, surprise flashing across his face before he quickly masked it with indifference. Eric. We stood there, the tension crackling between us. I wanted to hit him, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain I had been carrying. But I didn't. Instead, I said the only thing that mattered. Stay away from her. He didn't argue, didn't try to explain himself. He just nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of the damage done. When I got home that night, Sarah was waiting. Where were you? She asked, her voice cautious. I sat down across from her, studying the woman I had once trusted with everything. I saw him. Her face paled. What did you do? Nothing. I exhaled, running a hand through my hair. But it made me realize something. She swallowed hard. What? I can't keep living like this. We can't keep pretending that things will go back to how they were. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't argue. She knew it too. And so, we made the hardest decision of all. We decided to separate. It wasn't dramatic. There was no screaming, no anger. Just two people acknowledging that some wounds don't heal, that sometimes love isn't enough to erase the damage. Packing my things was surreal. I had spent years in this house, built memories in every corner, and now I was leaving it behind. As I stood at the door with my bags in hand, Sarah reached for me one last time. I never stopped loving you. I looked at her, offering a sad smile. I know. Then I walked away. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. I deserved more than a love that made me question my worth. And for the first time in a long time, I was choosing myself.